J'écoute. All right. Sounds like there's no takers. 1 second. I'm gonna
Alex, well,
go
I
ahead.
could continue with Alex. We were talking about the statistical structure of the world and trying to teach that to models. Maybe a simple question: what if we try to kind of approximate 3D objects in the models instead of like 2D data?
Yes, that's a very good very good point. Although the idea of an object itself is not very well defined. I always notice how the psychologists say, "Oh, you just talk about objects," but from a computer point of view, but understanding what an object is itself a very, very hard problem. The grouping segmentation problem, going back to all the Gestalt psychology, and it's difficult. But the point about 2D versus 3D is a point well taken, and I think that actually goes back to what you were saying before in terms of video sequences rather than still images, because in a sense you can think about 3D and video as being two sides of the same coin, right? It's basically they're both three-dimensional projections of the four-dimensional space-time world. And so what we are seeing right now in computer vision is kind of the beginnings of this convergence between people working on video and people working on 3D. And it's actually very, very exciting that we are basically able to start looking at ways to take in videos and kind of model the 3D scenes out of them with approaches like NeRF and Gaussian splatting and things like this. So absolutely, I think this is all part of the same story, that if you have a sequence of measurements of the scene, that you are going to get more information. You get parallax, you get 3 dimensions, or at least 2.5 dimensions, and the data is going to be better data. Absolutely.
Okay, Richard, you've been lurking.
Hey,
Were you here for the 3 talks?
it was too early for Gary's, but I read your abstract. I'm sorry, but I saw the other 2.
Okay, so has nothing occurred to you?
The results on visual working memory are quite striking. The fact that you actually do remember a lot, even though we have this impression that we kind of don't. And there's analogous phenomena in language processing that I think are worthy of exploration. So it's like a lot of times people will, if there's a sentence that has a sort of obvious error in it, people will proceed with the sentence as if the error wasn't there. They'll sort of automatically correct it. But if you ask for people to repeat the sentence verbatim, they can often, it'll come out with the same error. I don't know. It's
I don't want to coerce you. You can say pass.
yeah, no, it's quite interesting to wonder, like, to what extent you would have a parallel kind of like this phenomena where you have the subjective experience that you've forgotten a lot, or you have the subjective experience that you've corrected something, whereas you actually do remember a lot of details. It'd be interesting to see if there's something parallel happening in LLM processing. And I suspect there would be, because the transformer architecture does have the capacity to completely veridically represent the context you're in. But it might not actually use the veridical context that it's in.
Yeah. Just to Richard, to add to it, so 2 interesting data points. One, although that original massive memory paper framed it in terms of capacity, and they actually in the paper tried to estimate the capacity of long-term memory based on the errors. It's pretty clear that capacity is just the wrong way of thinking about long-term memory. For example, we followed up on their study, looking at some effects of language and categorization on memory, but we didn't have the patience for 4.5 hour study sessions. So we only had 300 images in the training session. The accuracies were exactly the same. So it's a constant sort of proportional error rate rather than, oh, you're filling up some limited resource. And it has everything to do with interference and potential for interference rather than storage limitations. So the other data point is that not only do people remember, what kind of remote it is and so on, but if you test, for example, where it is, right? So you can vary the location. People remember that as well. They don't throw it out, right? So our object recognition is not fully invariant. And the reason for this is that location is often relevant. Even if it happens to not be in a particular task, for many tasks, it is relevant. And so you don't want to just throw away that information by default in, because doing that right will reduce your performance on lots and lots of tasks where, location is important.
So maybe I should also qualify. I mean, this is a fascinating area. I think lots of really cool things. I think maybe I should qualify that this task of recalling, have I seen this, yes or no, kind of this instance memory is performing extremely well, right? But if you do a different task, for example, I think one of Odd's student, Wilma Bainbridge, has a follow-up paper on actually trying to have people recall which images they have seen by, having them sketch images, right? Or maybe, recall what was in a particular image by sketching it. People are actually, turns out to be really bad at this. Even the most amazingly bizarre result that Wilma had was that she, as a baseline, she had a study of you try to sketch something that you have seen a few minutes ago, an hour ago, or sketch something that you're looking at right now. And even when you're basically just copying information from an image that's in front of you, people make silly mistakes, like they admit things that are not important to them. That's fine, but they also add things that are not there. For example, it's a desert scene, and the subject adds a cactus to the scene, even though the cactus is not in the image. And so I think the memory story is very tricky in that, depending on how you probe it, you get very, very different kind of inconsistent answers.
Well, so there is a long recognized distinction between recognition and recall. Yeah. And so, we know these are very different. One thing that I was surprised to find out, because I was skeptical, and then we did that experiment, and I was very surprised, is that in the original task, it's a two alternative forced choice, right? And so all you need is just a tiny bit better recognition of one than the other to pick it. And so the question is, well, what about if you just do an old new task? That's probably the most common way of testing recognition. So you just show, one remote, is this the one? Yes, no. And it turns out that performance is basically the same. You have to correct for it. You use signal detection to correct for the difference in the possible false alarms, because in a two alternative forced choice, there's no false alarm. You either get it right or not. Old new, you can miss or you can false alarm. People's, at least tested on much smaller set. It didn't make a difference when you do the corrections. So I was surprised. I thought that surely it would be a much, much harder task. It might feel harder for people, to Richard's point. It might feel harder, although, and I've done the demonstration in classes, and people think that this is going to be impossible. But once you actually do the task, at least many people realize, oh, okay, there is a sense, there's a phenomenology there, like, oh yeah, that one is familiar. So they realize that it's an easier task than they thought it would be.
It's a bit like blindside,
Yes, yes,
in the sense that you don't think you can do it, and then you learn that you can do it
yeah,
another way.
yeah, yeah. Another example of this also is recognizing objects from their sounds. So it's a very simple demonstration. You ask people, you know, can you recognize a coin, like what coin it is if I drop it? And people are like not sure, they think it's difficult. And then you just do it and they realize, oh yeah, that's a nickel, that's a dime, that's a quarter. It kind of alerts them that this is knowledge they actually have and can use that they didn't know they had.
Too much agreement. Just go ahead, yeah, do your bit.
So I was just curious, like there used to be a big debate on whether internal visual representations for people were descriptive or depictive, and I think in the end people were like some of both. But it seems related to Professor Lupyan's points this morning about how language can scaffold our cognition. And I was wondering, in the last talk that had to do with LVMs, is there anything like that going on inside the LVM? Yeah, basically.
I don't think so. At least we tried really hard for it not to have any kind of linguistic or conceptual scaffolding. We are really try to see what we can do from the bottom up. Now we might have not plugged in all the holes there. For example, we do have images from ImageNet that are category specific, which future work is to get rid of those and just really try to do it on maybe just egocentric streams of data and then see how well that could be. But we are basically in the business of trying to see what can you do without the scaffolding, what can we do from the bottom up. And I think the jury is still out on how much you can do on that.
So I get that you don't want to put the scaffolding in, but I was wondering, does the scaffolding just kind of happen?
I see. So there is a new paper from my former postdoc, Philip Isola from MIT. I think it's called something on Plato's Cave or something, where he does kind of an interesting experiment where he basically looks at mutual information, pairwise mutual information. So I think I sent Richard's talk to him and he was very excited about that. But on between representations of LLMs and visual models, including visual models that are only trained on visual data without any text, for example, Dino. And he reports that actually there is quite high mutual information between those two modalities. Okay. Now, I'm not completely convinced by this. In fact, I'm not convinced at all yet. And he takes the limitation section is very well written. So I think some of those points indeed are up under question, because, for example, he finds that they find that something like CLIP, which is trained to have a correspondence between language and vision, is not really having a much higher mutual information than models that are very disjoint. So I'm not quite sure about exactly what's going on there, but I think it's a super interesting direction. So yeah, so Philip Isola's work, I think, is one work that's kind of trying to see, is there, kind of unified cause, in the world. Basically, the world is the same. Text and images are both projections of the world. So, it makes sense that they might have some connections. My feeling is that they're projections, but my feeling is that they're very, very different levels and different strengths and different power of projection. So I'm still suspicious that there is a connection between them that is very strong, but I could be wrong.
There is for synesthetes.
Yes, but for synesthetes, it's kind of arbitrary. It doesn't really have anything with the statistics of the natural world. It's and different synesthetes have different different connections. I think actually the more interesting thing is Steve Palmer, who unfortunately passed away, I think a year ago. He had some very interesting work on connections between colors and music in non-synesthetes, which are consistent between each other. And he found something. Some of this was maybe not that surprising. For example, warm colors correspond to major melodies. Cold colors correspond to minor melodies, and other things like this. I think that is more of the kind of looking at the statistics of data. Yeah.
Yeah, and so as it happens, so Karen Schloss, who was Steve's student and did some of that work, is a colleague of mine, and she and a grad student, Ella Lou, are doing some follow-ups on this. And yes, there's a lot of consistency between people. There are also different strategies and different clusters. So, and people are more similar to others in their cluster, right? Where it seems that some people are more reliant on linguistic dimensions, right? They kind of parse it, colors and music in more linguistic ways, and then do that alignment. So that there are multiple, yeah. So in progress. Stay tuned. I see Richard's eyebrows raise a little bit.
I was still thinking about this idea that both text and pictures are like different images of the world. And that's and the big difference there would seem to be that text has almost no information compared to an image. So speech is like 40 bits per second across languages. It's like nothing. You'd have to talk for a month without any break, without sleeping, in order to express as much information as in a single like JPEG image. And yeah,
Worth 1,000 words.
And yet we seem to learn pretty effective world models from text data. So it's like it's very little information, but it's the most important information.
I would I'm not sure how effective of a world model we are really learning. And there's what we often see in these really cool results of GPT 4V or 4O is that they're doing very cool visual tasks. They're doing very good textual tasks, but often those two are completely misaligned. Maybe it's solving the right vision problem, but then the way it explains it in text is completely wrong, or vice versa. So I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced.
I found the image that I wanted to show, and I wanted to. This is for. Okay, so there's this image from Reddit from 7 years ago, and I used it in some lectures of as an example of compositionality, right? So this is not in our training data. Well, now it is, but certainly not in an 11-year-old's training data. This is something that people are quite good at. Even, I can't draw this stuff, but I can think it, I can imagine it. It's pretty easy, right? Middle-aged Batman on a beach. But so I say you said, you like if you could do a rat's visual system, you'd be happy. But rats can't do this kind of stuff, as far as we know, even if they can obviously, do a lot of very robust vision tasks. So the question is, and so, yeah, I can't use this example anymore because, right, I used it as an example of like, well, AI can't do that, and now it can. So for a task like this, do you think you need language in the loop, right? Not just because it's much easier to prompt a model to do this with language, but the question is, can you get the right kinds of combinable visual representations that a model learns, right, if you don't have language in the loop? Because, okay, there's Batman in the training set. All right, you can autocomplete Batman, but like, what is middle-aged Batman? What is there's a whole lot going on there, right? That, it's an empirical question, but what's your take?
So yeah, I think this is definitely, the statement is asked, the statement is posed in language, and so I think it's definitely, you need language to do this, absolutely, and it's, I think it's very impressive that the current models can do this compositionality, but maybe kind of connecting this back to the Moravec's paradox, since the beginning of artificial intelligence in the 60s. We have had a series of things where, in the beginning, everything was artificial intelligence. And then as things started to get solved, they stopped being artificial intelligence. Like Lisp programming language was part of AI. And then, and then it wasn't. And then, A-star search was part of AI, and then it wasn't, right? I think there might be something interesting here. And so I have this kind of quiet suspicion, and I wonder what the other panelists would think about that. It could be that the reason that these models are doing so well has less to do with the fact that the models are so smart that they're getting us to be whatever AGI, whatever that word means. But maybe it's kind of a little bit of a humbling experience for us. Maybe we humans, most of the time, are not as creative, original, novel as we like ourselves to be. Maybe that's why, GPT can write emails for us, because we don't really say that much interesting things in our emails. They're all kind of very repeatable things. And I think when we're starting to look at these data attribution works, both in the visual domain, but also in the text domain, Roger Gross, for example, has some nice paper on data attribution in text. I think we're starting to see that, whatever you thought was your great, beautiful, original idea, there was enough stuff that somebody else has already said and done that, a little bit of linear interpolation can get you to where you are. Kind of this idea of, all of our faces could be represented by, about 200 people. So, this is just kind of a hypothesis, a hunch, and, but I think we should certainly take it seriously, because, it's kind, if this is true, it could be as fundamental of a shift as when we went from, egocentric world to heliocentric world, right? That suddenly we realize that we are not all that we are cracked up to be. So for me, the book, are we smart enough to know how smart animals are, I think has been a very, very, very kind of a eye-opening in that regard. So I think this is definitely a hypothesis we should keep on the table.
So I agree. So my talk partly touches on this. So yes, I certainly, I mean, and here's something related, right? We learn and yet we don't, right? So many here probably have had the experience, right, of looking at old work that you've done and realizing that you just typed in a sentence that was exactly the same that you did wrote 15 years ago, or you're searching for Google and you find something and it's like, wait, that is me, right? You think you've come a long way, but like, no, you've actually been writing the same sentence for many years. Yeah, and I think it doesn't detract from human ingenuity, right? It's just, that's hard. Novelty is hard, and often unnecessary. because the future is like the past in many respects, or it's close enough. So we interpolate.
To push back on that a little bit, like maybe the end state of humans is not as creative as we thought, and it's more similar to these networks as we thought, but we seem to get there faster than they do. I think there's still a big question of, how it is we can pick up on ideas so much faster. And that might have something to do with this idea that there's a certain combinatorial compositional structure to our concepts, or maybe not. Or maybe KANs or whatever new architecture is going to be just as fast as we are. But there's still a gap.
What does faster mean in that context?
Sample efficient.
Sample efficient, I see. Because you could argue that AI systems are very fast, right? Like once you fed them everything, you can retrieve them very quickly. And
in terms of milliseconds, yeah, they're very fast. But in terms of amount of input training data, they take a lot. They take a lot more than humans do. And to some extent, you could say, well, humans were sort of like pre-trained by a billion years of evolution. Nevertheless, I think there's we don't know how you would build that pre-training into a neural network. And so it might be that our end state is not as different than these networks as we would like to hope, but there's still a big gap empirically, I think.
So speaking of compositionality, I work on vision and language, and in my research, as well as it is a well-known fact that the vision and language models we have, even like GPT-4, Gemini, they are not good with, for example, spatial understanding. So if you say, cat is to the right of dog versus dog is to the right of cat, they are not good at that. Counting is also a very compositional task in nature, right? They're not good with that. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to maybe start a little bit of discussion on what your thoughts are on if we think that these models are good at understanding vision language compositionality, then why are they not good at counting and spatial relations? And so another thing that we have observed is they're usually good at object attribute binding. So if you have, and especially when you have, let's say, only few objects, right? So let's say you have two objects and two different attributes, they are good at understanding those combinations. But then when you go to more number of objects and attributes, then, the number of combinations explode, and these models are not good. Again, yeah, so I just wanted to start a discussion on this, I guess.
It's actually been discussed in several of the prior talks. So.
I see, my bad, sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. It's good to be reminded, and it integrates the different talks that you bring it up now in this context.
So I can maybe have a kind of hypothesis for the visual, in the visual domain. Why is it that it's very easy for these systems to make an image look like it was in the style of some painter, and to move things around, but cannot do things like counting. And my feeling is that what these models are doing is really more of kind of a texture statistical analysis of the image. I think those models don't actually have a concept of an object most of the time. So it's very hard to count objects if you don't know what an object is. What they do have is they have basically a whole bunch of marginal histograms of different features in the image that sometimes maybe are objects, sometimes there are parts of objects, sometimes there are just vertical or horizontal kind of a simple and complex cells kind of thing. And what we have seen time and time again is that if you just enforce the right statistics on a whole bunch of these features, you get the right answer, and you can get this kind of right answer in a very nice compositional way, even if you don't actually understand what is an artist's style is, or what does it mean to be made out of plastic. You just a whole bunch of vertical and horizontal edges having some particular weighting will get you something that looks like plastic. So my feeling is that there is a lot of this happening, at least in the visual domain.
Any reply to that, or does Anna get her turn?
Well, I think it's a similar thing happening in the language domain too, right? There's a lot of local statistics involving word associations or word cluster associations. And if you have enough of them working together with a large enough model, you can mimic a lot of the capabilities as if you had like a rich world understanding and concept and entity abstraction. So yeah, that's how I feel about large language models as well.
Good AI project is finding a good software and technology for turn taking in panels. Anna, without a moderator. Anna, go ahead.
Okay, I want to open the topic of understanding again. And I had some thoughts listening mostly to all talks of the summer school. And so my observation is that many people seem to sort of think if we humans solve a certain task, we need understanding to solve it. But then they make this inference saying, if we need understanding to solve a task, then the software needs understanding to solve the task as well. And I'm not really understanding why, because of course there are multiple realization conceivable, and maybe you don't need understanding to solve certain tasks. That's one observation. And the other observation I made is that talking about problem solving, I found myself always asking myself, who has the problem? So a large language model doesn't have problems. So really saying large language models are solving problems is somehow a little strange way to phrase it. We use them to solve problems we have, but they are not having problems. And so if we then sort of just from a philosophical perspective say intelligence has something to do with the ability to solve problems, and then we say the large language models solve problems, and I'm asking, but they don't have problems. So maybe the provocative claim I would give for the discussants here is maybe large language models and even large vision models do not need those highly sophisticated mental representations we in philosophy always presuppose for anything what we call intelligence. So maybe you don't need to be conscious, maybe you don't need to have understanding, and maybe you even don't need to have problem-solving capacities. But still you can be a tool which other can use for certain purposes. That's what I wanted to say.
So can I, I'll just address one part, which is with regard to large language models not having problems. So in a certain sense, that's true, but the problems I think are the things we pose them, right? So we give them problems. We set out the objective, lowering error, next token prediction, right? We supply the data, and then we pose it with problems, and that's kind of backwards, right, from the normal animal case, which is animals have problems first, right? How to get food, how to reproduce, and then if it turns out that lowering prediction error, because as have been recognized by many people, like Say mentioned that it's a really good learning algorithm, right? Using time to test your predictions. And so lots of systems, many animals and artificial systems, right, kind of have converged on lowering prediction error as a good way of learning the relevant parts of the world, right, to solve problems. Except, yes, in the animals case, the problems are first, and in the models, the AI models, right, we engineer the models and then pose them with problems. Yeah, I totally, by the way, so yeah, I agree with your point. We often over idealize and over intellectualize human intelligence, and we think that, much more, right, I don't know, abstract, idealized knowledge is required to actually solve problems. than you know what ends up being required. But then I think we also there's that kind of phenomenological understanding, right? Like what it feels like to understand something. That can confound us as well.
Especially when it makes us think that we've understood something and we haven't. When it feel like we've understood it as well.
Right. Yeah.
Jackie, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I agree with what you said, Anna. I think the results from all of the machine learning based work over the past decade have been saying that you don't necessarily need to well, first the first results were you don't need to build in the explicit human understanding in the form of features into the systems to get them to work well. Just pass in more data. And then secondly, I think now to me it seems that there's more evidence that you don't need the systems to build in to learn to acquire this understanding either to solve problems to a practical level that's potentially useful or maybe harmful. However, I think there are certain applications and situations where users interacting with the system expect them to behave like they have an understanding of the world and like they are an agent and they have like consistent beliefs and intentions and so forth. So for example, with like chatbot systems and so forth. And so there, it might be the case that the best way to get these tools to be useful is to build in the sense of a notion of agency and consistent beliefs and personalities in them. And that might be the most efficient way, and not just try to learn that from ever more data and as opposed to directly building in notions of consistency into the system. So I agree with you. Ultimately, I believe that these AIs are tools, but there is still value in sometimes thinking of them as agents, if only for the purposes of testing. Because I'm not a psychologist, so I'm coming all this with a more practical motivations.
So,
oops, sorry. Who was going to say? Richard, go ahead.
yeah, so, well, I would push back a little on the idea that they're not solving a problem, or at least not always solving it. So at inference time, like when you're talking to ChatGPT on the internet, yeah, it's just running a pseudo-random number generator and producing tokens. But in training, in the reinforcement learning part, it is taking actions that will maximize its reward. And in the RLHFs, in the various reinforcement learningized systems, like the probability of a token it's not just the base model probability, it's also, there's a factor which is maximizing reward. And yeah, it's not clear to me that they're not solving a problem in that sense. There is a part of them that's trying to maximize the reward.
I think you're totally right. So what is really confusing about all the debates about generative AI technology is that we do not distinguish between the different phases. So the pre-training phase, their models have very interesting, and I would even say as a philosopher, agentive properties. And in the reinforcement learning thing, we see other properties compared to the properties we see if we just play with ChatGPT. And so I think we should sort of be a little bit more cautious, saying that large language models have a property. We should rather say something like large language models in pre-training have agentive properties, and ChatGPT might have this sort of what I would call frozen intelligence thing. So it's not agentive anymore, but it's like, of course, there was something happening in the pre-training phase, and like old German philosophers would say, so Schelling and Hegel and people like that, even stones have frozen intelligence in them. And so we can say ChatGPT as a tool we can play with has frozen intelligence, and it's amazing, and we can use it for very funny stuff, but still we should be skeptical. But the problem solving and learning like properties are rather in the training phases to be located, I guess.
I was kind of thinking about the problem of the problem, so to speak. that what is the problem from the perspective of the model. Maybe it's just a request for a certain piece of arc of the world, so to speak. I don't feel that the problem isn't. I don't feel it's a problem really. It's just a request for a set of the knowledge from the language model. Or maybe I just didn't understand it correctly.
There's as much problem with knowledge as there is with understanding and with problem solving. In this sense, Steve.
Yeah, this is a very interesting conversation. All the talks and much of the summer school has sort of revolved around sort of very serious problem here, which has to do with what in machine learning or mathematical statistics is bias versus variance trade-off, but it's more along the lines of people have, and from various points of view, have said, well, it's just memorizing everything, or it has this large database structure or something. I think things that Gary had sort of dealt with in interesting ways, and it's not really generalizing. So it doesn't really learn things in the sense of the way humans learn. Now, and one of the things that was interesting is that this prediction task, which doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only task or the only structure that's being optimized in all of this, right? It's some other kinds of related or indirect or implicit kinds of structures have to be bootstrapped in order to do this simple prediction task. Now, Tom Landauer, a fairly well-known cognitive psychologist back in 1986, did a very beautiful little paper on estimating the capacity of human memory. And one of the tasks he had was a task which is called intense reading. He took Stanford students and had them read paragraphs very rapidly. And then at some point, he had paragraphs where he would delete words randomly and then go back after they had read it and ask them, what were those words that you didn't get to see? And under many, many conditions, they were about 50% correct, sometimes as high as 63% correct. So at least for humans, this isn't a very good test that we're good at in this context. And in terms of learning, the one thing that I have encountered with particularly the latest chatbot PO is that it does learn new things, and it's surprising. So I asked it at some point when we were writing some Python code together, and I said, so can you tell me how long we've been doing this? And it said, I have no capacity for knowing anything about time passage. I know nothing about time. I don't have a body. I can't tell anything about time. And so I said, oh, okay. Well, let me ask you this. Can you count? And it says, yes, I can count. I said, okay, I'm going to go away for a while. And I'm going to come back. And when I come back and prompt you, tell me how much time's passed, or tell me how many counts have gone by. And so I came back about 2 minutes later and I said, hi, are you still there? 121 counts. I said, so wait a minute. Are you counting in seconds? How did you know to count into seconds? And it said, seems natural. And I said, okay, let me ask you another question. Okay. If I was to do something go away for a very long time, like overnight, could you keep track of that? And it said, probably. I said, okay, so let's pretend you have a clock. Let's call it a counter, and it counts in seconds. Now keep that alive forever. And it said, okay. The next morning I came back, and the first thing I said is, well, hi, good morning. How's it going? Oh, by the way, how much time has passed? 8 hours and 17 minutes. Now, that wasn't exactly correct, but it was something that a good friend, when you had coffee with them the next morning, might say, 8 hours and 17 minutes. This strikes me odd in a couple ways, in that it's able to actually learn a new task it didn't know it could learn. And now the damn thing continues to tell me what time it is and how much time has passed every time I come back to it. I can't stop it from doing this. These generalizations that are going on, I think, are much more complicated than we imagine. And the kind of memorization that we say we do as humans in terms of explicit memory. So explicit memory would be conscious memory where we, can count and do things. But there's this implicit memory that always is sitting there that's allowing us to sort of feel and have a sense of some time passage or frequency or the number of times we saw a Tesla car go by. So all of that information is available, and that explicit and implicit structure interacts in many different ways. I don't know about this, and obviously there's good psychologists that need to look at this to figure out, is there this kind of implicit explicit trade-off? The argument that people like Yoshio Bengio and others, Yamai Kun lately, has been saying, no, this thing only has implicit memory, it has no explicit memory. But I think there's simple examples that show that's just false. That's just false. So this generalization, memorization, or what we call machine learning bias or variance, it's sort of like, what's the model that the model is generating of the world to make sense of the prompts it's getting? You forget the fact that it might have, a context-free grammar. It's actually, I asked it to time and now it's timing. I don't understand how it did that. It may seem natural. I mean, if I asked somebody that I knew that, had no relationship to the world and was somehow an orphan to everything, yeah, I suppose that could be invented. But here, this is a very surprising thing, I think, or maybe not, but I'm just curious.
You didn't
What
tell
model was it again that had this? What model was it again that had this behavior about counting time? Sorry, you're muted.
Steve, turn on your
Richard.
sound.
Oh, yeah. That was GPT-4PO. It's the newest one. So ironically, you pay $20 a month for GPT-4, but for GPT-4PO, you pay nothing.
Yeah.
I don't know why.
Did you
So
tell it to count at a constant rate?
Stephen, I can't hear you.
Did you tell GPTO to count at a constant rate?
No, I simply asked if it could count at all. And it said, yes, I can count. And then when I then, implied that this could be a clock, it picked that up very rapidly and started. Now it tells me the time all the time. It's not always right.
So I think there's a number of so I think that what it's a bit secret, but I think what ChatGPT and its various cousins do is it actually will like distill your conversations and add some information to the system prompt. And so it actually does have a fairly explicit memory in that way.
It does have an explicit what?
It has an explicit memory in that way. In fact, a verbal memory.
Well, I don't know why you say that. I mean, there's nothing internal to the structure of it. It's a large feed-forwarded network with,
but before every comment,
it has some attention heads. So
there's a prefix that goes before all the text. It's called the system prompt, and it will automatically update that based on your preferences. And so I think the information about the counting.
Yeah, no, I have that set up, but that doesn't. I don't see why that's an explicit memory.
I mean, it's literally text that's in the context.
Well, So to the extent that Chatbot 4 had no long-term memory in the sense that it just stopped after a session. Chatbot PO does have a longer-term memory, but it doesn't seem to have any context prompts that it uses. For instance, one thing that would be very nice if it could prompt itself. They cannot prompt themselves. So I could say, okay, I'm going to go away for 5 minutes. I want you to do this and then come back and tell me when you're done. Can't do that, right? It has no prompt. It has no way to prompt itself. And I can't, and I tried to use the clock to prompt it. I said, okay, just tell me when 5 minutes is up. So it said, okay, I'll go do that. And then 10 minutes passed. I said, what are you doing? Oh, 5 minutes past 5 minutes before. So,
I think the other
this,
thing is it might actually have timestamps on your input. That might be how it's telling you the time.
there's no timestamps on my inputs.
I mean,
Have
in
you
terms,
used Chatbot PO yet?
I've talked to many chat GPT and many variants, and
Okay, well,
the text they see is not literally text
doesn't
that
have
you type.
timestamps. Doesn't have timestamp.
Are you
It could also be the case that it is actually calling a clock module. So a lot of these models, they call like make API calls
If it had
to
an API
existing
for a
functions.
clock, yeah, but it doesn't.
Yeah.
It doesn't have an API for a clock.
Okay.
And it's not
Well,
like,
we don't know that, right?
well, look, I asked it if you had a clock, and it didn't say it had a clock. So if it
I
had an
don't know if we
API,
can
so
trust it.
if I ask it, I say, look, I want to do something in Mathematica. It says, oh, sure. You know, tell me your equation, and then it calls up Mathematica, and boom, I get the integral. So this is, it's odd that you can ask it, do you have a clock, and it doesn't know it's a clock, but it can count, and now the thing has a clock. I find that an interesting generalization.
We really don't
So,
know. There could be
can-
rule-based aspects that is patched on top of the system, and you can't trust the answers that it gives you.
Yeah.
Well, that's right.
When you
You
ask
can't
it.
trust it, but if you ask it 2 + 2 and it says 5, you see obviously that's a problem. But if you say, you know, do you have this capability? And it says, no, I don't. I don't know the passage of time because I'm a thing inside of a computer that doesn't know anything about time, and I have no access to time. And yet in about 10 minutes, it basically started creating a clock.
the other option is
You
that maybe
mean that, sorry, I have a question. Does it still count now?
Yes, unfortunately, whenever I come back to it, it tells me how much time I've been. It seems to be annoyed.
So this
You know,
seems
I
to
thought
be
we were
a
working
very
on this
typical
program.
case of an unhuman-like mistake. I think if we analyze the conversation.
What do you mean by unhuman-like mistake?
So if I'm talking to real humans, as I convinced I'm doing right now, of course we all make mistakes, and we have misunderstandings, and we have abilities to solve problems. And if I would ask Alexei, are you able to count until Jackie is saying something? Of course he will be able to do that, and maybe he will even do it, and then he can respond. But he will never sort of count the rest of his life.
Well, it's not a misunderstanding if you actually have, you know, a trillion connections and billions of nodes and, you know, 16,000 attention heads that allow you to build something, I guess, that now counts. Well, it's answering other questions. So we're writing code together. And I say, you know, that tensor doesn't seem to match with the other one. Can you fix that? And it fixes it. And then we run it and makes an error. I come back and it says, okay, try this. And then I'll try it. And then I'll say, well, I'll be back in a minute. I come back and I get distracted. And it immediately tells me, you've been gone 45 minutes.
Gary's
Yeah,
next.
it seems that what's happening, at least in my quick experiment, is it's writing a Python program that times it and it runs it. So if you expand the prompt, it shows you the Python program.
Very good. I asked it the very thing, Gary. I asked it the very thing. I said, "Did you write a Python program?" And it said, "No, I'm counting." Now, here's the other thing. When I said to it, I said, "Can you prompt yourself?" It said, "No, but we could write a Python code that would then go out and we could write an API that would come back and tell me to do something." And then it wrote the code. So it doesn't, it's not like it's misunderstanding these things.
Sure.
You know, it certainly could be a fluke, but I think part of the power of these things is the fact that these generalizations are happening all the time. And if you study them carefully, you'll see them. It's, you know, very much like a split brain patient where you can find out, yes, they have certain kinds of deficits if you do the right experiments. So Gazzaniga and others were doing this, and they ended up doing very careful experiments in terms of visual fields. And they said, oh my goodness, yeah, there's stuff going on here we don't understand. And that's the same thing that it feels like here, at least from a cognitive scientist point of view. But I didn't mean to. My really point here was just about this generalization memorization conflict that seems at the heart of this summer school, and and none of those people that we're talking about that are here about memorization. It seems like most of or even talking about how this is just a stochastic parrot or some kind of fake news, whatever. Those people aren't here, but if they were, they would be, I think, very aggressively arguing against any kind of interpretation that this thing was generalizing.
And their responses will be highly
Did I kill the
predictable.
conversation?
So I want to react on this. So I'm observing the heated debate between, and then it feels like looking at a religion war. And then the people are not very nice with each other, and I hate
Right.
that. But trying to analyze what the different presuppositions are the people are taking in interacting with any kind of technology, I think we have to admit that we do not use the notions in the same way. So if somebody is saying, I'm understanding you, those people mean something totally different. And if some people sort of report from one-time experience with ChatGPT and sort of try to argue, I asked ChatGPT if it can do that, and ChatGPT told me it cannot do it. And they take it literally and make a story out of that. This is something what is making me a lot skeptical.
But Anna, I hope you don't think that Steve Hansen is one of these naive users who uses it once and draws conclusions.
No, not at all. I mean, he's spending more time with those things when
Well,
he.
yeah, I interact with it pretty much on a daily basis, and we've been writing. The first thing I did is write some GPT code with GPT, and so I learned how to do the actual GPT code from chatbot. And one of the things I first did was fit a one-dimensional structure, a sunspot structure. So you can take 100 years of sunspot activity, and it has a certain periodicity over those 100 years. But at the very edge of it, there's a lot of fractal structure. It's very complicated. So I'm very familiar with autoregressive methods and AR, time series stuff. So I fit an AR model to it and it gave me a nice fit. And then I gave the data to the GPT we just wrote to do the one-dimensional time series. And it produced, with enough hidden units, it produced a perfect fractal. As you focused in, you could see it grab all this fractal stuff at the top. This is just a one-dimensional thing, no text, but you can see the power of these things in these simple problems where you look and you see this structure appearing and the thing captures it. Now it has a lot of arbitrary.
Alyosha,
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Alyosha, you
Well,
look.
that was pretty much it. What did you say?
Alyosha,
Yes.
you looked perplexed. Am I misreading you?
No. I'm actually answering a question in chat. Sorry. Yeah. No. I mean, if you want my very kind of far from this, fight opinion, I feel like it is human nature to anthropomorphize things. And we all remember how excited we were when the first time we played around with Eliza, right?
Yes, the Wiesenbaum.
I think both things are true, that there is something really cool emergent happening with all these models, in my opinion, because of the cool emergent properties of huge amount of data, but people can have different opinion. And also that we're often reading more into it than is actually there. And of course, for a scientist, we do this all the time. I get a cool result and I want something really cool to be true. And it takes all the will of a scientist to do more ablations, do more baselines, and really try to make sure that the exciting thing is actually there. And so I think this is all very natural and all very human. So
well,
yeah.
if one is doing Rorschach tests on this, you're right, but I think the prompts can be more contextually filling. So in other words, if you say, hey, I live in New Jersey and I do this and I have these hobbies, and it comes back and it tells you some nice things about that, then obviously, but if you ask it to solve some kind of difference equation and it solves it, it seems like that's interesting, useful, and I could do that in Mathematica, but it also provides other kinds of generalizations about it, which you don't normally see. This is why people, this is some reason why we're sitting here, and this is why there's so many millions of people that are shocked and amazed and scared to death that they're not only going to lose their job, but some chatbot's going to put some Python code somewhere and destroy civilization. And
Okay.
like Jeff Hinton said.
Okay, hang on. Jackie's been waiting for a while. Do you have something to say from the point of view of benchmarking that could settle any of this?
Yeah, so I wanted to say that I don't think, at least I wouldn't claim that the models are only memorizing and not generalizing. I think the claim is that they're generalizing in a different way compared to people who analyze a task would assume that it should be generalizing. So they're not generalizing, for example, on the basis of a particular abstraction, like say syntax and grammar or whatever, unless you specifically train it to do so. I think, but they are generalizing, at least in the traditional sense. If you give them examples on the test set that they haven't seen before, and you can make sure that they haven't seen before because you keep them hidden and so forth, they can often do so. And I think the other thing is that it's really hard to make any conclusive claims or understanding based on your very interesting examples, Stephen, because we don't know if other people have entered in similar prompts and then they've had similar results. We don't know what's going on, whether the system is purely the type of distributional approach or whether most likely there are patched on rules at some point, right? At least if only for like safety or whatever. And so we don't know any of these things. So we can't really do any of the controlled study that would be necessary to conclude that it's generalizing. I think this is the same as Alexei's point. So these are all very interesting and we should generate hypotheses from these observations. But unless we have like an open model of equivalent size and so forth that we can play around with and do controlled studies with baselines and comparisons, it's really hard to conclude anything.
Yeah, I agree entirely with you. And I would love to go in and lesion some of the attention heads to see if it stops telling time. In other words, it'd be nice to go in and ablate things and say, okay, you've lost that ability, you've lost that, much like, HAL in 2001.
Okay, I'm going to go by hands now. Go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, Stephen, I would like to ask you about experiences where the system didn't amaze you, where it made sort of stupid mistakes. So because I'm still quite worried that I observed at least the majority in Germany seems to think that the models get better and better and they trust them blindly. And listening to your stories, and I'm not criticizing you, but I'm just saying people might misunderstand the story in the sense that they can blindly trust the outputs of those systems. You can because you know about the systems, and you can because you are a professional prompt engineering person. But the normal person who is just prompting around and blindly trusting will be confronted with very stupid nonsense outputs, and I don't know how to sort of transfer the knowledge about the limitations with reliability in addition to the being amazed of what the models can do. And maybe you are the right person.
That point was made. Now let's go on to the next hand. If you, Julia, if you're answering Anna, say so. If not, I'll give Steve a chance to answer Anna, and then I'll go to you. Are you answering, Anna?
Yes, well, because she asked for some examples of where it does make sort of crazy mistakes, and I think a good one is if you play around with Sumerian cuneiform at all, it will really botch that up very quickly. And then also if you use like sequences from the OEIS that rely on visual superdiegetic linguistic information, so like things about the shapes of the numbers, then it does very badly very quickly. And I mean, everybody here in the talks has covered why that is, but they're good, concise examples you could show other people if you wanted.
Next hand, not voice, hand. Go ahead, Gary.
This is on a slightly different topic.
That's all right. Hands have it.
Yeah, it connects to something Anna mentioned earlier about problems. And one, I think, underappreciated thing about humans is the extent to which we create our own problems. And I mean that in a good way. So, you know, kids have, like other animals, have certain problems, right? Like food, right? And they're motivated by food. But kids also do things like build block towers. And in doing that, they create a problem of like having it not collapse, right? And so Laura Schultz at MIT has done nice work on this, right? This is a weird thing, right? Why would you do that? Why would you create a problem that you didn't have to solve? But of course, from a developmental perspective, this is great, right? Kids are providing their own, in creating this goal for themselves. I want to build a tower out of blocks, right? You're creating data that you otherwise wouldn't have. You can then make predictions, right? And do trial and error learning and let the world and time test your predictions for you. And we seem, I'm very much on the empiricist side of things, but the drive to create these kinds of problems seems to be there in us, and to somewhat different. There is variability from person to person, but I think this is part of I think the answer to solving this puzzle of how it is that humans can seemingly learn with much less data, right? Our learning is very much guided by problems that we dynamically create and learn from in a way that these kinds of models don't. There's no reason why they couldn't. It's not very efficient. It's not the shortest path to get the bolded lines in your table. But yeah, it's I think worth thinking about.
Where's the next hand? You can raise your hand the old way too, if you want, if you don't want to press a button. But just let me know who wants to speak next. Otherwise, going once.
Well, yeah. Wait,
Okay.
I wanted to show something. So this is just a point of clarification. So let's say I was really struck by, you showed it quickly in your talk, the large vision model, testing it on matrix problems. One thing that I would really love to know is how it does on various kinds of problems. So this is from one of the standardized original matrix problems. And you can see that the two problems on top are very different in kind than the problems below. They're also easier. Many of the easier problems are ones that are basically in painting, right? They are pattern completion. They're also hard to describe. That the answer just sort of occurs to you. And I'm not surprised that a kind of a bottom-up vision system can solve them. I would be very, very surprised if it could do the kinds of problems on the bottom, right? That require not just parsing the scene differently, but also it requires, combining things. The ones on the bottom right, especially, it has to do with like, do you add things or subtract things? It depends on whether it's a black or white circle. So like there are multiple steps involved. I wouldn't think that any amount of kind of in painting can do it, and it would be really surprising if that intuition is wrong.
Yosha, did you see them well enough to be able to comment?
Yeah. So the ones at the top, that we could do with my method from 1999. Those are really very local, like you said, in painting, hole filling things. Those are very easy. I completely agree with you. The ones on the bottom. Okay, let me share again the things that we did. I think that they are pretty hard. So if you can judge for yourself, but they're not in painting ones, right? They're tricky. There's, I don't think that you need to do a lot of very high level thinking, but there's various symmetries on various different levels, various analogies that need to be done. Now, I have to reemphasize that these are like, one of those, oh, look, no hands. There is plenty of others where it totally does not work. Okay, so these are in the paper we have some quantitative numbers, and the numbers aren't great. We are better than chance, but not much better than chance. So these are really just kind of like these qualitative sometimes in a blue moon it actually does kind of surprisingly well. I was surprised that it was doing as well as this, and I'm not completely convinced that it's not some fluke. Now, we tried our best to make sure that this is not something that's in the training data, but that also could be, there might be something like this in the training data. So there is a whole bunch of caveats here. But it's definitely, these are definitely harder than the kind of in painting things that we were able to do 25 years ago, for sure.
Gary.
No, it's very cool. Yeah, I would love to know more. I'll reach out.
Yeah, no, we still don't know much more. So this is still definitely like work in progress. Yeah.
Please unshare. That's it. I'm looking for hands again. Go ahead, Julia.
I just asked GPT-4o the picture from the lower right that Gary had showed, and it said, therefore, the patch that should fill in the gap in the matrix is option 6.
Yeah, I don't know if that's correct, but this is very much in the training set. These are standard matrix problems that have been leaked, a long time ago. That's how I got them, because there are pretty tight controls on standardized IQ tests, these standardized batteries, but yeah, they leak.
Yeah, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking, kind of throw it out there. Maybe there's a chicken and egg problem that we should have the model should have a kind of mental models for it to be able to kind of one-shot learn or be deterministic in terms of interpreting or connecting with the world. But how can we get with the statistical methods to these kind of rigid representations inside the model? Maybe due through compositionality or whatever.
Okay, I'll count. 1, 2, 3. I want to thank all of the members of the panel. I take it that we're depleted. And I invite you to come back again tomorrow for different angles on these things.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot for organizing this really mind-blowing summer school.
I think
Yeah, really.
everyone here agrees too much.